So welcome, mai mai haere mai, and great to have you on board. Love the cat. Reminds me of old times. Folks,
I'd wear it. My connection to Kiwi landing pad back in the day was in San Francisco, so I thought, why not, eh?
Yeah, cool, man. And we'll talk about that too, because it's a great start to introducing you, really. I mean, we came across each other when you were doing your first startup, and also a really interesting community play, which was kind of accidental, which I'm looking forward to talking about with folks. But Territory 3 community, welcome.
Here in the background, so I'm just relocating to.
Look, it's always better to have some sort of live action thing going on in the webinar, and moving us around. You can show us around the orchard. But folks, welcome. This is the first Territory 3 webinar for this year. Unfortunately, Annette Presley had to pull out of our last one. In fact, I think Lilia did one. But welcome, as always. It's an interactive session. I'm really pleased to have Mike here. He'll talk a little bit about himself. If you do have any burning questions as we go through, which I'm sure you will, just put them in the Q&A section. So feel free to chat amongst yourselves, and thanks for your support in my time of technical difficulty through the chat. But if you have something specific you want answered, we'll make sure we stop at minute 30 just to look at those questions and go through those, and then about 10 minutes before we stop. So enough of me. Mike, if you could just give us the version of life for you to this point, as I say, rolling back to the days of Grad Connect and moving us forward.
Yeah, right. So my story is one of I guess a lot of serendipity. I finished university in, I think, 2004 as a graduate in computer science at Victoria University in Wellington, and I joined the Westpac graduate program, where I met my two other co-founders on the startup that I would go on to create called Grad Connection, which was, essentially we got together and decided that there wasn't really any great resource for students who are researching their first career jump, and we decided to, long story short, quit our jobs at Westpac all on the same day and moved to Sydney to start what was essentially in 2008 a website for university students looking for their first job, which doesn't sound like anything special now, but in 2008, it was everything was print media and careers fairs at the time. So we started that, and after 12 years, we were in the position where 4 out of 5 university students in Australia were using our website and our products to find their first job, and we got acquired by Seek in 2019, which has led me on to my new adventure in the New Zealand primary industry. And alongside that time at Grad Connection, I also founded what I think is still the largest co-working space in the Southern Hemisphere, called Fishburners in Sydney, just above Wynyard Station there. And that was essentially a co-working space that spawned out of my company Grad Connection, where myself and my co-founders were left in this position where we needed to either take over a much larger lease than we could afford, or we had to move out of the office that we were in, and we decided that the best solution was to go to IKEA and buy a bunch of desks and put it up and start renting those desks out on a per desk basis to our mates, which again sounds like nothing special, but in 2009, 2010, that was an unheard of way of doing things. And so, basically built Fishburners from what was, I think, 18 IKEA desks at $100 a pop, up until, what it is today, where it's been heavily supported by a huge number of corporates and government entities in New South Wales as well, and continues to this day to be, quite the landmark in the Australian tech startup scene. I stepped down from the board off that, I think, in maybe 2017, 2 years before I sold my business, because Grad Connection was starting to really consume a lot of our time. And after selling that business, moved straight back to New Zealand with my young family, and moved into the world of zero fossil fuel food production, which is where I'm sitting now. So hopefully that's a good 3 or 4 minute summary of my career to date in the startup scene.
That's a wicked summary, thanks, mate. And I love the lack of polish to the story of the founding of Fishburners. A lot of people I'm familiar with would have turned that into some sort of strategically oriented, this is what we built and this is how successful it was, because it was all intentional, but it was kind of, as you say, serendipitous.
My whole everything that I've done has been based on valued based sort of decisions in my life. And so when we started, Grad Connection, it was because there was not really anything that was suitable for students, and I was a student at the time, to find all the potential opportunities. And we all thought that we missed out on some of the potential opportunities that were available to us because we didn't pick up the right magazine or didn't go to the right careers fair. And so my values at the time were helping students. By the end of it, I was 33, I think, when I sold that business, and didn't really have much of a connection with students anymore. So I was getting fairly fatigued with that business and moving on to, a better value set in terms of, or a value set that more aligned with me as an early, a young 30-year-old, which was, the climate change and getting into that space. And I have a business now that, has, some people may have seen it. It's, had quite a bit of publicity, but I still don't really know what I'm doing, and I haven't really built an investable business yet. But here we are doing the same thing again, and I've just learned throughout that time that whether at Grad Connection, Fishburners, or Forest Lodge and NZ0, it's just following my vision and following my values to the point where living a very purposeful existence. And at some point, I'm going to figure out how to make it work. And so that's where I'm at again right now, is in that process of figuring out how to make it work.
That's very cool. And so I guess the themes today, our audience online, and as I said to you, a lot of folks take this on demand later in the piece. It's really about, I guess, the road ahead for founders this year. So some pretty interesting conditions forecast. I've spent a lot of my time in office hours confidentially just talking through probably more challenges than opportunities, and I think that's probably going to continue. So I'd love your thoughts, sort of just to kick that aspect off, from co-founding Grad Connection through to, I guess what you've been able, or you see as relevant in that journey in terms of the ups and downs of building anything, primary industry or technology, and what sort of remained true to you in terms of, other than the values which you've explained, what's remained true as a founder to the kind of core principles that you still use today, and what's maybe changed in that journey as you've matured?
Yeah, I think I was actually just having a chat with Tracy before about this. When I was in my early 20s, there was a bit of egomania, I think, involved with starting a startup. You wanted to be seen as being successful amongst your friends. You wanted to be seen as being successful amongst, your previous colleagues, the students that you shared university experience with, all of those kinds of things. And by the time you're in your early 30s, you don't give a shit anymore. And I think it's at that point that you don't give a shit anymore that people sort of realize there's a level of authenticity or genuine nature about what it is that you're trying to achieve. And so I was joking with Tracy before that, I'm experiencing the dopamine hits of a business that's had quite a bit of focus on it recently, just like I did when I was in my early 20s. And that's something that I've recognized as a really interesting thing for me, is that I do thrive on those dopamine hits. I do actually think I quite like being the center of attention from time to time. But I guess the main thing now is that I'm not doing it I don't think I'm doing it from an egocentric perspective anymore. I'm doing it more from this is how I want to promote the values. My value now is, how do we get the hell off fossil fuels as fast as we possibly can? And, everything that I'm doing around that, relates to that now. So yeah, I'd say that's probably been the biggest shift between my early 20s and my early 30s, is transitioning away from, some form of egocentricity and moving towards, sort of more value-centric business purpose. But apart from that, everything else has remained static, right? Like, I'm a fiercely loyal co-founder. I think that's a hugely important thing. I also, I'm also very excited about change and chaos and just trying to make things easier and better. That's a big part of what I'm trying to achieve, and that's always remained constant. And the other thing about being an entrepreneur is, a blatant disrespect for authority. That has remained something that has existed from now and until where I am today. If someone tells me I can't do something, it makes me want to do it more. And yeah, so I'd say that's probably it. Like long term, the personality has been very consistent. Some of the drives or the motivations around what I'm doing have drifted slightly away from, being about me to being about what I want to achieve. But I don't, aside from that, I think it's all very much the same.
Very cool. And like Tracy said on the chat, it is a bit addictive, isn't it? These hits and also just recognition for your purposeful stuff, right?
And I think that's the important thing. Like I've seen a lot of startup founders go under in my time. And one of the things I always come back to is if your individual personality is bigger than your company, you're always going to end up in trouble. It should always be company first, purpose first, and then you're just riding the wake of what it is that you're looking to achieve in this world. And if you can get into that kind of position, you're going to go a lot further than if it's always going to be about you. I think that's a really important lesson that I've learned along the way, both from my own experience as well as being a spectator and other people's successes and failures in the space, for sure.
So let's connect kind of climate change / sustainability to founders, because frankly, as I said to you in the sort of pre-call, I don't think we really get that yet. And in my governance role, the last 2 term sheets I've been involved in negotiating have both had an ESG clause in them in terms of requirements for very early stage companies to actually actively, authentically demonstrate their strategy around that. So maybe if jump in on any angle you have on that, but if I frame that up about, going back to the days of Grad Connection and actually being in today's context, let's assume that there's still nothing serving that market, still market opportunity. But in terms of what you think now, how as an early stage company would you, authentically embrace both the sort of people and planet aspects of what I guess a lot of founders still see as big corporate stuff under this terminology ESG?
Well, so I mean, it depends on what your startup is, right? Like in the case of me being in farming now, a lot of it comes down to climate and environment. But if you're, say, creating a SaaS product, that is not going to be as relevant to you. But ESG doesn't just mean climate; it also means how you treat people, how you treat the people that end up working for you. And so, I think the first thing is the clause in that term sheet. Like actually take the time to look back at the VC or the investor that's looking at this and try to figure out from there, is this clause there because they're just ticking a box themselves? Is that clause actually there for authentic reason or a non-authentic reason? Or is it something that they really stand by in their values? There's thousands of VCs out there. And your lead VC should be the one that you actually align to from a values perspective, because as long as your values align, through the good times and the bad times, you're going to be able to figure out how to make it work with them. As soon as your values don't align, if you're, say, more focused on environmental outcomes and the VC that's going to be investing you doesn't give a shit, you're going to end up in a bad situation. Equity is like marriage, equity is for life. And so you cannot, you have to make sure, just like the person that you want to spend the rest of your life with, you have to align on the same values. So that would be my first piece of advice is, find a VC that aligns with the values that you align with. And that ESG just doesn't always just mean climate and water and, the environment for which we're, in my case, I'm farming. ESG can mean, how you treat people, how you pay people, how you interact with your local community, how you interact with the global community, and just find an investor that aligns with your values, because let's be frank, you're not going to be able to change your values. You are who you are. And so I think that's probably my best piece of advice, right? Just like finding a co-founder or finding a life partner or whatever it might be. It's your values are never going to change, so make sure you find someone or a partner that values align with yours.
I think it's great advice, and certainly in my latest venture, all things considered, we're finding that actually consumers, when you get them in a comfortable space rather than ticking a box on a survey, actually almost embarrassingly care more about the social aspects, how much friends are getting paid in retail stores and those things, than they do around the sort of green climate aspects. And it's not that they don't care, it's just that their priorities in terms of making consumer decisions and buying decisions are actually more that way oriented. And they almost feel a bit embarrassed sort of sharing that with you, which is kind of a real challenge for businesses.
It's also an interesting point that you raised, right? We're talking about sort of the internal mechanisms of a business here, which is around how do you raise capital to fulfill the goals that you want to fulfill. But the other part of this is, ESG very much aligns from the consumer side of things. What we did this year is we marketed a commodity product, New Zealand cherries, with a zero fossil fuel brand, and we created a certification around that brand. And what we managed to achieve in the market, I'm really quite proud of. I think we could have gotten the vicinity of 20 to 25% more gate return, we call it, so more revenue back to my farm per kilo than anyone else in New Zealand growing cherries. And so a part of that ESG alignment is, if you do it authentically and do it properly, people will actually start to swap. And in the case of any startup, the hardest thing, it's easy enough. Well, it's hard to obtain a customer, but it's even harder to obtain a customer off somebody else. And so if that's the position that you're looking in, then you have to be authentic about, ESG, because some of those customers will never care and some of those customers will care greatly. And as long as you're authentic and they can identify that their values align with yours, then you're far more likely to pick them up and far more likely to keep them.
Yeah, 100%. And Tracy was just saying in the chat too, I mean, this is also about your supply chain. I know, it's been fantastic that you've been very transparent about your journey, which is, I guess there's competitors that are clearly seeing what you're doing, and now you're, connecting that to revenue results that actually show that it's worth doing.
This is the interesting thing, right? Like, the only way we're going to solve climate is through collaboration. And I don't care if the cherry orchard down the road, who would be a traditional competitor of mine, wants help, because at the end of it, it's in my best interest and my family best interest and your best interest and everybody's best interest if they also start a journey of decarbonisation. So we're bordering on a completely new paradigm of the way that we do business here, which is not the our parents' generation, which is all about land grabbing and carving off a niche and protecting that niche. It's almost a much more collaborative way of doing business, which I think is something that at the moment, with traditional thinking is a really hard thing for people to invest in, right? Because what are you investing in if you're giving everything away? But potentially what you're investing in is authenticity. I think if you can invest in the most authentic business, the consumer will always stay with that authentic business in the long run. That's sort of my theory moving forward.
Yeah, and to your point, it's relatively new in terms of consumers actually doing something with it. I mean, I just saw a survey from McKinsey last week where they analysed what people said. 70% of them in America, it was a US study, wanted to live a more, said they wanted to live a more sustainable lifestyle. But when they analysed $400 billion of CPG, consumer packaged goods, and real data, there hadn't been much shift up until only a couple of years ago, but now it's just taken off.
At the moment, sustainability hasn't been made easy for the consumer. It's like my little boy just turned 4 years old, and he really wanted this fire truck, and it's a piece of plastic made in China, but he wanted it, and that's fine. Like, he's 4 and he deserves a fire truck, in my opinion. But the amount of packaging and the amount involved in that, there wasn't really a good alternative option available. It's hard to be sustainable as the consumer at the moment. And so what can we do as business owners and startup founders to make it an easy decision? Because if I put my cherries on the shelf next to some, let's say, less sustainable cherries on the shelves, the consumer will pick mine. And so I think that's where the real opportunity and entrepreneurship in startups and entrepreneurism lies in New Zealand. Entrepreneurship in New Zealand is the fact that we have this unique opportunity to position ourselves in a way that it makes it easy for the consumer to do what they say they want to do, because that in every business, if you can make something simpler for someone, they will exchange that simplicity for money. And so that's where we're playing at the moment, right? We're trying to figure out ways to make the decision easy for them so they can feel good and look good to their peers by going down that sustainable path.
And I guess thinking about those that are not in the B2C space, in the B2B space, of course, everything comes back to customers of some sort at some point. What would you be thinking about if, sort of put more of your earlier venture hat on today about being a B2B business and just what the key things are to trying to understand your customers and how they're dealing with this consumer shift?
Well, when we started Grad Connection, it was a really interesting space to be playing in, right? Because our major competition were these print booklets that were handed out at universities, and there was also careers fairs. And online, there was sort of seek ads, for example. And the problem is that all the information will go stale really quickly. If you print something in a booklet, it goes stale quite quickly. If you don't get hold of that booklet when it's distributed, how do you get hold of that booklet? Likewise, with a seek job ad, it was up for 30 days at a time and then it disappeared. The interesting problem that we had was that a seek job ad at the time, I think, was $200, and to go in one of these print booklets was bordering on $10,000, right? And we were trying to sit in the middle somewhere and charge sort of $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 to go on a website. And so that was a really tough position to be in, right, at the time, because why would we go on your website for $5,000 when we can pay $200 to go on Australia's largest job board? But what we were able to do is position ourselves in a way of saying, well, the information is going to be up online all year round. You can change that information whenever you want to, so it's always relevant. But I'm a student, and I know for a fact that I was looking for jobs right throughout my academic career, and the information was never available online, and it definitely wasn't available in these booklets. And so we positioned ourselves quite differently. And while it's not directly ESG related, I guess, it is positioning ourselves in a way where we're being different and solving a problem that everybody knew existed for the student, but we were the first ones to get in and do it. And that's essentially what this is all about. It's the same premise, right? Is there is a big problem in the world, and how you position yourselves to solve that problem is probably going to make a big impact on the way your customers end up receiving you. And so I think people were flabbergasted that we were charging, by the end of it, we were charging $20,000-$30,000 per annum to some companies to essentially put their job ads up on a website that they could have done for $200 on Australia's largest job board. And so, yeah, does that kind of answer the question? Like I see the immediate relevance
around your more dynamic, more flexible, and probably just actually building a history for job seekers to actually see what's been going on, and that's what you're paying for rather than tactical, and that feels very relevant to the challenge we're having today, both in the ecosystem, especially for top talent, and up until recently in tech. Obviously been a lot of layoffs now, but what I'm finding myself and talking to other founders is that having that purpose and having the authenticity of the mission behind you is actually really making a difference in terms of who you can attract, but also, what they will accept from an early stage remuneration point of view. Now, at some point, they're expecting that mission because they believe in it to reap more things, as you said earlier, in terms of the traditional rewards of dollars and so forth. But it feels like, especially in these younger generations, there's more of a sort of evaluation of purpose, and I think you don't get that off a job seek ad for $200.
No, exactly right.
So, sort of reversing again, I'm sort of traversing between the future and the past. Hopefully, this is fun for you. It's like it's old memories kind of going down the line.
I haven't actually spoken about my startup life in Australia for quite some time. So yeah, no, that's cool.
So dirty little secret exposed, Mike. But the governance side of things is something that right at the early stages, I think founders need more perspective from people like you. Talk to us about Grad Connection and NZ Zero and the differences, if any, in the approach you've taken to actually getting, both that formal direction and that sort of, these are the skills and experiences we need to actually help us grow the business at that sort of board level.
Well, John, I've always been terrible at governance, and so I think the first thing I went through was you've got to have. In the early stage, governance it's hard to put a formal structure around something that is just so chaotic, which is the first few days or first few weeks or even first few years of a startup, right? And so one of the most important things is a co-founder team that has very complementary skill sets, very similar values, and is built around the same mission. So therefore, you all trust each other. So in my early days of Grad Connection, we had someone who was particularly strong in the financial side of things. I was particularly strong in the computer programming side of things, and my other co-founder was particularly strong in the marketing side of things, and that worked really well. And so for a long time, in fact, Grad Connection up to the point that it sold, the founders were the board. But right. That is also because we bootstrapped the whole way and never ended up in a position where we needed to bring on external money. And as a result, we never had anyone wanting to be on our board either. So I guess organically it kind of grew that way. By the end of it, when we were getting acquired, there was quite a bit of, I guess, business hygiene that needed to be sorted out in terms of finances and accounting and stuff to make sure that a publicly listed company was able to buy this 12-year-old startup that had been continually run by 3 people who had organically learned how to do everything along the way. And, in reality, that was quite an inefficient process. So there was nothing untoward, so to speak. It was just, I don't know, publicly listed companies want discipline, and there were places where we were definitely lacking in that space, and so there would have been at some point the optimum time to maybe bring in further governance, and that never happened, because we were just continuing to grow the business that way that we were growing it. It all got sorted out in the end, but that was the first thing. And so when I came back to New Zealand, so the second thing is when I founded Fishburners, it was a much of a different game, because we were founding Fishburners with a whole bunch of different startups that wanted to be involved in creating this opportunity. And very quickly we realized we were all working on our own businesses, and our own businesses needed to take priority, right? Because they were our businesses, whereas Fishburners was a co-working space. And so very quickly we established some governance around that to make sure that it could be run, and it could be run in the workload that could be shared, because it wasn't any one individual's baby. People say, oh, wow, you founded Fishburners, and I did, but in reality, Fishburners would have remained a frat house of a co-working space had other people not come in and turned it more professional. And so from that side of things, the governance was poured in really early and made a significant difference into the way that Fishburners developed. Since coming back to New Zealand, I did my board of directors course, because I've always been very weak on the governance side. And from that board of directors course, I learned a lot, but I also learned that I'm not a director. That's not my personality or my role. I'm not there from a governance perspective. I will always be a CEO. I'll always be the one trying to grow businesses and making it work. And I need people to keep me in check in that regard, allow me to expand and grow, but also rein me in. And the great thing is, now I've got two co-founders working on NZ0 with me that have very complementary skill sets. We don't have a formal board yet. We haven't raised money yet, but we'll be looking at doing that shortly. And I have my beautiful wife, Rebecca, who is a CFO, who now keeps me in check, and that I like to spend money on things to further my mission and my values. And we've got to make sure that, that's kept in check and that's accounted for, and that there is a plan on how to get that money back at some point in the future. So, I think from that perspective, I've been through both very formal governance to very loose governance, and in between as well during that time. And I would never advise one way or the other necessarily straight up. It really comes down to how the founder in question wants to run their business, and both ways can work really well. At some point, your business is going to grow up and need it, and I think probably some of the talent is working out when that is. And other times, your business will raise money and you'll immediately have it, because anyone investing in your business is going to want that layer of governance to make sure that their investment is as safe as it possibly can be.
Yeah, I think that all makes perfect sense in terms of those different scenarios. It's a great exposure in terms of your scenarios.
Yeah, I do think sometimes people over-engineer it. They try to go down the path of governance too early, and I think that often can lead to hamstringing the entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs at the end of the day are creative people. We might not be creative in the sense that we can paint paintings, but we're creative in the sense that we're creating demand out of nothing and then sort of supplying that demand. And so for a long time, you don't want people who are very good at governance from stifling that creativity. I think part of being really good at governance is also recognizing, when you are potentially being a handbrake when you shouldn't be, and allowing those businesses to flourish and foster and take the necessary risks that they need to take in order to carve out their place in the market.
Yeah, cool. Let's talk about culture for a bit, and then I want to cover wellness, which I always do, both in terms of individual and for your teams. What have you seen? I mean, I'm intrigued because my view of Australian culture and business, and potentially personally as well, is quite defined and quite different to how I see New Zealand business culture. I'm not going to disclose my thoughts on it. What did you find being a Kiwi building a business predominantly in Australia?
It's really interesting, like Sydney in particular, the first question you would often get out, not the first question, but within the first 5 minutes, someone will try to establish what high school you went to. So that was really interesting. And I think being a Kiwi over there and having done my high school and university in New Zealand, people had no concept of whether the high school I went to was any good, and whether the university I went to was any good. And as a result, we got cut a lot of slack, I guess, in that sort of pseudo class system that kind of exists over in Sydney. And as a result, I was allowed to be who I wanted to be, right? And I don't think I think I had the advantage of not being particularly, judged or put into a silo or a box too early on in that piece. But I did see that happen a lot, like some of the public school kids that came out were, I think, in some cases discriminated against by that kind of culture that existed around, that sort of private schoolboy mentality in Sydney. So I definitely noticed that, and I don't think that exists in New Zealand. I'm very grateful that doesn't exist in New Zealand.
Only in Christchurch.
Maybe in Christchurch, but I mean, I don't think I would personally, and I'm sure you wouldn't either, John. Doesn't matter what high school you went to, it's not really about that. And so I think that's one of the first key differences, especially in Sydney. I'm not sure if that same sort of sort of culture existed necessarily in Victoria or South Australia or Western Australia, but in Sydney it definitely did. But the other thing about moving to Australia to start a startup is I felt like the New Zealand shackles had largely been broken from me, and that in New Zealand, I think starting a startup, I was very scared of failure. I was scared of how people would look at me from that failure perspective. And going over to Australia and being separated from, my contacts in New Zealand actually allowed me to be more creative and take more risk. I think one of the problems that, New Zealand still has is that I think that the term tall poppy is well overdone, but I do think there is some merit to when people talk about that, about how, it's not necessarily that you want people to fail, but it kind of there's that culture that if they do fail, it kind of validates the fact that you haven't tried. And I don't think that exists in Australia in the same way at all. Australians say that it does, but I think there is a distinct difference between the two cultures in that regard. And so, that's something that I'm, that I think the older generation of startup founders that I include myself in now, I'm nearly 40. You can see all the grey hair in my beard now. We've got to make sure that we support Kiwi founders to take risks and to feel comfortable taking risks, because that's always going to be something that will hold us back if we don't do that. And potentially I might have noticed the same culture in Australia had I been Australian and had a lot of Australian friends and not had that degree of separation. But I didn't sit through my own personal experience. And, as a result, I felt that I and my co-founders really flourished.
One of the conversations I'm having more regularly, usually reasonably regularly, but is with founders about when enough is enough, when it's time to maybe realize that the timing or the pressure or the impacts of things not really going to plan, more capital being required, even if it's your own versus investors. What are your thoughts on sort of ways to think about that sort of, do I go for another few months, or is it time to think about another idea that I could build into a business?
Are you in love with your startup? Simple as that. If you're not in love with it, it's kind of like the breakup with that partner that you've had for 3 years, but you don't want to break up because it's hard, but you also know it's probably the right thing to do. And the simple answer is, are you in love with your startup? If you're not in love with your startup, you've been in your startup too long. By the time I finished Grad Connection, I was no longer in love with my startup. I was probably out of love with it 3 or 4 years prior.
Yeah.
But at that point, it was big enough. It was getting to the point of being quite a large business. And entrepreneurship, I think for a lot of it is about freedom and creativity. And eventually, if you stay in that business too long, that freedom and creativity is given away. And so we were in this unique position where, all our chips were in the center of the table, so you didn't want to get up and walk away from the table because all of this work that you put in and all this effort and all this success would have been left behind. And it just so happened that we were lucky enough to sell our business and move on from that. But had we not sold the business, it probably would have only been 1 or 2 years before we would have figured out another way of probably moving on from it, because we weren't in love with it anymore. So I think that's a really important factor. And I think mental health is a really interesting topic. My big thing through Fishburners, through Great Connection, and now through NZ0 is imposter syndrome. I get it all the time. I'm sitting there, I remember the first time I really had, I wouldn't say a panic attack is the right word, but just like this anxiety just fall over the top of me when I was like, holy hell, we've got all of the staff that rely on us to live. We pay them, once a month, and that, we support that. And here I am, and I still think I'm a bit of a pleb. I don't really know how I got here. And all these people now rely on me. And I just, it was never really anything that I think was a massive, it wasn't a panic attack or a breakdown or anything like that, but it was this, this constant fear that, existed in the back of my mind. If I don't do this right, a lot of people rely on me and my co-founders. And if we don't do this right, we're going to let a lot of people down. And that continued on through Fishburners as well. Fishburners had a huge amount of publicity and press in Sydney and Australia in general. And here I was, the guy that basically constructed 18 IKEA desks, now dealing with multi-million-dollar sponsorship deals for Fishburners and being like, why am I here? Like, this is not the way that I had planned this to happen at all. Yet here I am, and everyone's, congratulating me on starting something. And I, built 18 IKEA desks and found far more talented people than me to take it to the next level, was essentially what happened. And here I was, the focal point of that. And likewise with NZ0 now, I'm a farmer that planted 9,300 cherry trees and manages to farm them without burning any fossil fuels, and somehow turned into an industry leader in this space. And I don't really know what I'm doing, yet here I am again. And so for me, that's a big part of, for me personally, imposter syndrome is a huge part of my entrepreneurship journey. And I've realized it probably always will be. And other people will have different anguishes that come with this as well. So I think your point on self-care is hugely important. As entrepreneurs, sometimes we feel guilty when we're not working. And that's something that I've definitely tried to stamp out in the last few years, is not feeling guilty about not working and taking time for myself and for my family, and trying to build up the balance in my life that I need in order to be sustainable. That sounds a bit cliche, but business sustainability also involves founders' mental health and physical health.
Yeah, 100%. And I started a podcast series, don't even know why, to be honest, last year. And one of my guests, Raylene Castle, who runs Sport New Zealand, actually was CEO of Australia New Zealand. So she's,
I couldn't believe how bad. But that is actually an example of schoolboy rugby gone wrong in Sydney. I love my rugby playing years in Sydney, but I thought she was treated terribly.
So you can imagine, her perspective on this imposter syndrome thing, and she's come up with a wonderful alternative phrase, which I think just resonates because it just takes the aggression out of that phrase too. It's like natural nerves. And to your point, demonstrating it, these are things that we think about and naturally sort of have anxiety about to some degree quite regularly. And it's not about eliminating; it's just about actually managing and dealing with it in a good way without all the negative consequences.
That's a really good way of thinking about it, because I've often sort of done a lot of introspection, I guess, and I've realized that the anxiety that I experience around that is always very authentic. It's coming from a very good place. And it's coming from a very good place. That's the first thing to acknowledge and be proud of. That if you didn't feel this, you probably aren't thinking the right way.
What are your biggest tips in terms of, talking about vulnerability and natural nerves and these different things around leadership, in terms of building that team and the core things that you see as just crucial to keeping them, motivated and committed to your cause?
Well, I think one of my biggest weaknesses in leadership is I'm very much probably too friendly, too peer orientated, and sometimes you need that separation, I think, between someone who is leading and someone who is part of the team. And I've always blurred those lines, I think, a bit too much. If we were ever working together in a startup, John, you and I would be best of mates. We would be hanging out, all doing things, and then we would be best mates with our first, second, third employees. And at some point, what I found is, like while that's very good and that can foster a very good culture, on the other side of it, sometimes there needs to be formality and discipline and all of those kinds of things. And when you don't have that, that when you've got that too much of a friendly relationship, that is a lot more difficult. And so that's always been one of my big weaknesses. And yeah, I don't really have any necessarily advice on leadership or how to be a good leader. I think the answer is to be authentic and to be vulnerable a lot, because I think people really open up to you when you're not presenting yourself as some infallible human that's perfect in every way. I think that fosters a much better relationship. But I think I probably do that too much. I think I overcook that a bit too much sometimes, and as a result, that's led to some, in my time, some situations with employees, with co-founders, with clients, where I've probably had to deal with friction that I found very hard to deal with because of the way that I built those relationships. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer there, but I do think you don't want to be too infallible, but maybe you don't want to go as too far as I naturally do, which is to be everyone's best mate either. There's probably a nice balance in there, which is something everyone will settle on. Everybody's different. Everybody will settle on their own style of leadership at some point.
And you're in the privileged position of, you mentioned co-founders a lot, and you've had these different experiences with co-founders. Does any of that perspective change in terms of, if I asked the question specifically to the co-founder relationship and setting that up right?
I think the thing, like I all my co-founders, I very much admire and very much value the time that we've spent together. But we all grow up. I started Grad Connection when I was 23, 22 maybe, and I sold it when I was 34. And people grow up in that time. And so I think the answer is that you're always going to naturally experience some drift with co-founder relationships. You're always going to experience different priorities. And that's natural. And I think the answer is that you have to be aware that is going to happen, especially if you run a business for 10 years. That is going to happen during that time. And the real skill set is not stopping that from happening. The real skill set is allowing that to happen in a way that works for everybody. And that might mean one co-founder leaves the business early. That might mean that one co-founder naturally moves into a CEO role and another co-founder takes a step back. It could mean that one co-founder moves to a completely different area of the world. There's all sorts of ways of doing it, but one thing I would stress is that co-founder harmony is probably the most important thing that a business can have. And if you don't have co-founder harmony, then the business suffers massively as a result. And so one of the things that I would always stress, and I think I've always been very good at, is making sure that we sort of try and hold on to that harmony and be flexible and make sure that people are allowed to do what they want to do, because when you're 23 you're out partying. When you're 33 you've got young children. It's a hugely different lifestyle at that point, and hugely different set of motivations. So yeah, that would be my advice: is talk regularly, talk small, and never let problems get too big.
Yeah, 100%. And folks, we're down to the last 10 minutes. The time's gone really quickly, as it always does, because fascinating conversations I find around people's journeys, and appreciate you being so candid and sharing, Mike. I want to sort of round out, if there aren't any questions, folks, I'll keep an eye out for those if you do have some, just around this whole sustainability journey, because for me, I mean, you're in quite a unique position from the way I see things and the people I talk to kind of experience both worlds, and really passionately committed, obviously, to the climate agenda. What are your sort of parting thoughts around where we're at and where we need to be, and just anything you have on the gap and how we actually kind of squeeze that and narrow that?
Well, with the climate, I think there's three possibilities, right? There's either you deny it, or what I'm seeing a lot more of now is acknowledge it but deny that you can do anything about it. And that's one possibility. And I see them almost as bad as each other now. The second thing is that you can get into a tailspin because the future is looking pretty bleak at the moment, and suffer. Your mental health will suffer as a result, or you can actively do something about it. And I've chosen to actively do something about it, and I've chosen to do it in a way that I think is really productive, and that you've got two sides at the moment, right? You've got a lot of sides, but you've got activism and you've got traditional business, and you've got academics and you've got entrepreneurs. And an academic has been talking about how we can do this for the last 30 years and that the climate change is coming. And you've got entrepreneurs on the other side that have been building businesses and actually making traction in their different areas. You've also got activists that are telling people what they need to be doing. And you have conservative business that is making good money and doesn't necessarily want to change, because why would you change in a situation when you're doing very well in business? And I want to sit right in the middle. I want to sit in the middle where I have taken a traditional business, and with that traditional business, I have applied as much sustainable practice that I possibly can. And so when I say sustainable, I mean specifically around climate, not so much around things as water or what sprays that we use, things like that, but specifically around carbon footprint. Take a traditional business, take the academic side of it, merge it together, and then don't preach. Like, I'm not about preaching. I don't want to say, hey, John, hey, look, I've saved 80 tons of carbon a year. What the hell are you doing? I want to be saying, hey, John, why don't you come and check out my orchard? Because I'll show you what I've done, and then you can decide whether you want to apply that to your business or not. And that's where I'm finding I'm getting a real impact, is that I've had thousands of farmers come to see what it is that I've been doing, because let's be honest, farmers are naturally very clever, inquisitive people. And if I can get them to come to the orchard and ask questions and learn, and I can help with some of the misinformation that exists out there, and they can see me as someone who knows what I'm talking about, is very authentic in what I'm doing and very knowledgeable in what I'm doing, then maybe I can start for them to, encourage them to start making small changes. But also, I've had hundreds of academics come out and see what I'm doing as well. And I've shaped, some of their thinking, I think, quite dramatically by bringing a level of business pragmatism to what it is that they've been trying to get, happening for a long time. And so that's where I see myself sitting, and that's where I'd encourage anyone who, is concerned about the climate. I think one of the big things, though, is I don't want to tell everyone that they should be or they need to be concerned about the climate. I don't want to be dogmatic in that regard, because for some people, their values align much more with, other things that are just as genuine or just as important, like, the working wage, or the living wage, sorry, or it might be around, modern day slavery, or, there's thousands of different noble causes to be a part of. And to be frank, if you try to spread your focus across all of those causes, you're never going to have an impact in any of them. And so for me, it's climate. For me, it's, wanting to show people how to do it without preaching to them that they need to do it. And if we can get enough people like me doing that, then potentially we stop with the excuses of, oh, why should we bother because China's not? Or if New Zealand completely stopped burning fossil fuels, then then it wouldn't make a dent on global emissions. And the answer is, well, you are kind of correct, but if we don't lead by example, if we're not truly authentic in the way that we do things, then the world's not going to change either. And so, yeah, that's the way I see it at the moment, is if I can sit there and help farmers figure out how to decarbonize, help make their businesses more resilient, because, wow, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen that resilience needs to really step up in New Zealand.
Yeah.
As a result of, if what I can do and what I can show people has 1,000x return towards the environment later on down the track, then that's a big win for me. So a long way to go, but a lot of promise at the same time, that people are really starting to take note now. We're seeing some traditional business related political parties that have so far been very quiet now, so all of a sudden being very active, at least vocally, with what they're saying about climate. And I think that's a really good move in the right direction. So yeah, let's see what happens over the next 20 years. But if it all goes to shit and we all end up dying, at least I know that I tried my hardest. That's all I can do.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, that's very sage advice and a great perspective. And I think, that's one of the things we've seen sadly from the corporate industry is let's get a framework like this is sustainable development goals. And, as a company, just make sure we've got a tick in each box.
One thing I'd add to this is that big business is a big ship with a small rudder. And I am convinced that it's small business and entrepreneurs that are the ones that are going to change this. Because we're dynamic, we're thinkers, we're more flexible. And I think that allows, what our role is that we can, I think what I see a lot of is big business waiting for technology to catch up so they don't have to change. Whereas we are change facilitators as small business owners and entrepreneurs. And so, that's where I'm playing in the climate space now, is electrifying an orchard when everyone was telling me I'm overcapitalizing a business that's, already run on the skin of your teeth. And the answer is, well, yes, 100% by traditional means I am overcapitalizing a business that has very, very small margins. But what's come of it has been a huge amount of attention to what it is that I'm doing. And I've actually managed to increase those margins as a result. So, let's continue to be dynamic and fresh thinking and go out and solve the world's problems, whatever they might be. Just hold on to the values that you hold dear and live a purposeful, meaningful startup life.
Yeah, and kudos to you for getting it through to the end point of actually showing the commercial returns, because I think that's the challenge for a lot of people driving impact messages is, just people, as your point, they're going to be into what they're into, and a lot of them just won't change unless they see a commercial return. And, things can deliver, as you've shown, a commercial return. Mike, it's been fascinating talking to you folks. If you've got any last minute questions, I agree, Tracy, great inspiration, and thank you. We will wrap up. Mike, I'm going to give you the last word in about 20 seconds to just impart one more piece of
and a monologue about my last words. That was the point to end it. Now I've got to come up with a new monologue. And
the pressure's on, mate. I mean, that's just the way it works, unfortunately. It's all about changing it up. Folks, I really hope you've enjoyed this. I certainly have. It's been great to hear a story of so many diverse elements of building businesses and the purpose side of things as well. For those of you who have friends and associates who couldn't be here today, it will be on demand online in about 90 minutes. So look out for that at territory3.community/academy. That's where you'll find all of our over 200, I think, webinars that we've done over the last few years for inspiration and information. Thanks to our sponsors, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, K1W1, Evander Management, Jasmine Investments, Amazon Web Services. Without them, we couldn't bring you the work that we do into the community. And Mike, thank you again. And the last word is yours.
Yeah, well, I'd say the last thing is how serendipitous this whole thing is, because, when I was running my startup Grad Connection and we'd started Fishburners, I spent a lot of time in San Francisco and spent a lot of time in Kiwi Landing Pad, which is something that you obviously set up. And at the time, I had no one to thank because I didn't know you. But thank you very much for founding this and starting it up, because it was incredibly useful for me. And I just think it's just a funny story how this has gone full circle. And, now here I am offering some value, hopefully some value back to you. So keen to support, what you guys are doing with Territory 3 in any way I can, and helping other New Zealand founders go down their journey, their values, purpose-based journey to success.
Thank you, mate. There was one more question. It's an important commercial question. Several people on the chat, I don't know whether you saw it, have asked whether you still have any cherries left for sale and where they could get them.
This is my big problem at the moment, is that I have electrified a crop that is only around for 6 weeks in the year. So my big thing now is I need to expand what I'm doing into another farming product that has ability to have something on the shelves 12 months in the year. And if you know Tracy Aitken and what she's up to, I think we've got a call coming up next, because I'm about to tell her exactly what my expansion plans are. But it's to get into viticulture, because cherries are a $50 million industry in New Zealand, and wine is a $2 billion industry. So if I'm going to have an impact on climate, I need to be playing in a different field. So I need something that can be on the shelves 12 months in the year, something potentially with higher margins, but more importantly, brand IP. And so that's where we're going.
Always thinking growth and purpose. Mike Casey, thanks so much for sharing. Folks, thanks for watching and catch you next time. Cheers.